Okay, good afternoon, and it's Canada Day today. It used to be called Dominion Day, but it's now Canada Day. My name is Evan Weiner, and I probably have seen more of Canada than most Canadians. And this is Vancouver on July 2nd, 2017, and it was part of the Canadian Day Parade celebrating the 150th anniversary of Canada.
The west coast of Canada?
It is, yes, it is about 30 miles north of the American border in Bellingham. So anyway, Canada is born in 1867, and this is where Canada starts, in Charlottetown, PEI, a little island in the St. Lawrence Seaway, St. Lawrence River. But there's one other thing that you probably know about Canada that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote about, Evangeline. Most American elementary school students, or at least when I went to elementary school back in the Stone Age in the mid-1960s in Queens, are introduced to Canada by a poem, Evangeline.
Where'd you go to school?
PS 151. In Queens. Anyway, it's a tale of Acadia. It's a poem by the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. That was published in 1847. The poem follows this Arcadian girl named Evangeline in her search for her lost lover Gabriel. Set at the time of the expulsion of the Acadians in Nova Scotia, which was about 1758, 1759. To 1763 or so. Evangeline has become a cottage industry thanks to Longfellow, but there is Evangeline. The expulsion of the Acadians was the forced removal by the British of Acadian people from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Islands, which in those days was known as Acadia. Some of the Acadians ended up in Louisiana. And that's where you get American Cajun culture, because these people who survived, if they survived, went down to what is now Haiti and then went back to North America into Louisiana. The expulsion, 1755 to 1764, occurred during the French-Indian War.
What was the expulsion?
Well, we explain it to you. I'm going to explain it to you. In all, 1,400 or 14,100 Acadians were in the region, 11,500 Acadians deported. Basically, it was, well, let's not beat the bush. It was ethnic cleansing. The English decided to get rid of all the French.
Isn't Acadia in
Who were the Acadians?
The Acadians were people who were living there at the time.
Where?
In Nova Scotia.
In Nova Scotia.
Yeah. Now,
But
this
Acadia,
yeah.
Acadia is the United States.
No, it's, well, there's Acadia National Park in Maine. But the original Acadians were in Nova Scotia. They were in Prince Edward Island. Some were in Maine as well. And they were French. They were French
Acadia
settlers.
National Park.
Yeah. This is Louisbourg. Louisbourg was the biggest fort in North America in 1758. French built it to protect themselves. But the English sacked it, and that's where the expulsion started. And I'll get into expulsion in a few minutes. Now, meanwhile, over in Quebec, Plains of Abraham is where history actually changes in North America, at least east of the Mississippi, north of the Gulf of Mexico. Because the English had claimed 13 territories in what is now the United States. And they also had the territories in north of what would be the United States in Upper Canada. So there's a battle on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. This is 1758. And the English would get Quebec City. It was during the 7 Years' War, 1759. The British, under the command of General James Wolfe, besieged Quebec City for 3 months. The city was defended by the French general, the Marquis de Montcalm. Very, very short battle, about 15 minutes. Takes place on this piece of land, the Plains of Abraham. If you've ever been in Quebec City, you'll know that's the Chateau Frontenac behind there.
Nice hotel.
Yeah, it's a nice hotel. Anyway, the British wanted the city. This was the jewel of the French at that point. Quebec City. It was a large, large settlement of French-speaking people. And here you are looking down from the Plains of Abraham. And the reason I took this picture is pretty simple. The English come up the St. Lawrence River, and the French decide we're going to wall off the city. If you've been to Quebec City, you know there's a citadel there, and it's walled off, and or ramparts. And so they didn't do the whole city. They left the cliff because they figured, well, there's a cliff there. No way any troops are going to be able to run up the cliff and get into Quebec City. The British and French had coexisted in North America.
Go ahead.
The American Revolution,
One.
the roots of the American Revolution are here in Quebec City. The British and French coexisted in North America, but the threat of French expansion into the Ohio Valley, why did they want to go there? Fox trade, fox fur trade. So the threat of French expansion into the Ohio Valley caused the British to get rid of New France, because they wanted the fox trade, or the fur trade at that time. So you have the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, Quebec City, and they decide, we're going to get rid of the French. We're getting rid of the French in Nova Scotia, let's get rid of the French in Quebec City, and Quebec. And they did. Basically, they took over, and the English controlled the city. In 1763, the French said, okay, we're not here in Canada anymore, we're gone. And Quebec City's French-speaking Catholic population went under the rule of the Protestant British. Now, the South. The South in these days is south of the St. Lawrence Seaway. The South. The South is Maine, which was then Massachusetts. It was New Hampshire. It was upstate New York. That was the South. And they're watching closely in the South, particularly in Boston. They know England has won in Quebec, chased the French out of Nova Scotia. The English pull their best troops. And the United States and Canada, its history is intertwined back in those days, from the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s. Taxation without representation.
It's treason.
Well, yes, it was treason. Yes, it was. Taxation without representation. Charter of Barbados in 1652. The Barbadians signed a deal with the English after they accused them of being taxed without representation. The English said, okay, you know, we'll be able to work out something, and they did. Well, the people in the South say, we're hearing things from the North. And the people in the South decide, hey, you know what? We need a nation. We need a nation immediately. George Washington, whether it was George Washington or others, Ben Franklin. Meanwhile, up in Quebec, the English realize that there's trouble in the rebelling colonies. And they decide, well, you know what? Let's take care of the people in the North. The Quebec Act is passed in 1774, and that led Les Canadiens, or the Quebecois, to have religious and linguistic freedoms, to openly practice their Catholicism and use their French. So they know stuff is coming down from the South, and they want to head off anybody who is in the northern colonies to join up with the southern colonies. The Canadians weren't unhappy enough with the British rule to choose to participate in the American Revolution. They were okay. The American Revolution starts in 1775 at Concord and Lexington. And there was a great deal of tension between Great Britain's 13 North American colonies south of what is now Canada, and the colonial government, which represented the British Crown. There were skirmishes between the British troops and the colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord. In Massachusetts, by the way, Massachusetts was not what you see today. Massachusetts was also Maine. They owned, it was the state of Massachusetts and Maine. And the following summer, the rebels were waging a full-scale war for their independence. Hello, France. Well, France helps out the Americans in the revolution in 1778, turning what had been essentially a civil war into an international conflict. Now, Washington and Benedict Arnold wanted to get Quebec. They didn't. Washington decided it wasn't worth the ammunition or the price of the ammunition to go to Nova Scotia, even though we could have had Nova Scotia, because people living in Nova Scotia were thinking, maybe we should become the 14th colony. Maybe we should go with those southern colonists. After all, we got cousins in Massachusetts. We're only separated by water. Maybe we should go. Liberty Bell, 4th of July. Over in Quebec, in Quebec, they decided not to go with the southern colonists, but in Nova Scotia, they're talking about it. Should we go with the southern colonists? Should we listen to those people in Boston? Boston's not that far away. Should we listen to them? Should we join them in their defiance of Britain? Well, there were a couple battles, Battle of Fort Cumberland and the Siege of St. John's in Nova Scotia. But there was a lot of skullduggery, a lot of backstabbing in Nova Scotia, and also the English were using Halifax as a port. That is Cape Breton near Sydney, or in Sydney, Nova Scotia. By the end of the war, the American Revolutionary War, Nova Scotia had outfitted a number of privateers to attack American shipping. British forces based in Halifax succeeded in preventing American support for rebels in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia decides, we'll stay with the Brits, even though our cousins across the river, because Nova Scotia was big. They cut in half for New Brunswick. So it's right across the river from Massachusetts. While the British captured many American privateers in battles such as the Naval Battle of Halifax, 1782, many continued attacks on shipping and settlements in the final months of the war, the American Revolutionary War. The Americans would beat England in Yorktown. The war is just about done in 1781, and England would go back to fighting France. They cut America loose, or what would become America loose, and basically they cut their losses. Treaty of Paris, signed September 3rd, 1783. America becomes a country. Treaty of Paris, American and British negotiators signed a treaty ceasing hostilities and recognizing America's independence. The war formally ended in a Paris hotel room the morning of September 3rd, 1783, when both sides signed a treaty pledging to forget past misunderstandings. You remember who was fighting the war. Every day people were fighting the war, but they were fighting the war on behalf of the 3% of America who own land. For most people in America, it didn't matter if Americans formed a government or stayed on this British rule. After all, women weren't really counted. Negroes were 3/5 of a person, right? Women couldn't own land, didn't do a lot of stuff. Well, you know what? So it's the rich people. Rich people that want to pay taxes. Eventually, America becomes a country. But Nova Scotia, the English controlled Nova Scotia. 1784, what they don't teach you in school. There were a lot of loyalists, King George III, still in the southern colonies. They had to go somewhere. They couldn't stay unless they were pledged to become Americans, which they didn't want to do. So they were sent or relocated to a new place called New Brunswick, land taken from Nova Scotia. St. John in New Brunswick would become Canada, it's not quite Canada, first incorporated city. Statue of Benedict Arnold, traitor or hero? Is Benedict Arnold a traitor or is he a hero?
Both.
To whom? You got the answer. To whom? Well, he flees to St. John's, New Brunswick, 1785. Goes there with his son, Richard. Speculated in land and in business. And they're doing trade with West Indies territories. Benedict Arnold purchases large tracts of land, acquires city lots in St. John and Fredericton. But they flee. They go to London in December 1791. So Benedict Arnold had a problem in New Brunswick. Bad business deal, petty lawsuits, they chased him out. So they didn't want him on the other side. So was he really even a hero to them? The answer is no. Here's a question. Who won the War of 1812? Canada or America?
America.
Actually, there was no Canada. And the War of 1812 had no winner and had no loser. Because basically, by the time the war ended, and it ended before Andrew Jackson, the two sides decided, you know what, we'll go back to the land that we had prior to 1812. June of 1812, the United States declared war against Great Britain. Remember, Canada's not a country. In reaction to three issues: the British economic blockade of France, the impressment of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will, and British support of hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. Oh, also, that fur trade stuff, that's still in play. 36-year-old America declared war on Great Britain for a second time. Now, the plan was a little different this time. They're going to take all that territory in the north, which would eventually become Canada, and North America, at least from the Gulf of Mexico to the Mexican territories, which actually extended into Utah. It would become the United States once and for all. There was a faction of U.S. Congress made up mostly of Western is Kentucky, Tennessee, and Southern congressmen, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, advocating for the declaration of war for years. It's the war where the Brits burnt up the White House. British put the White House up in flames. Why? Well, because the Americans were burning places in Ontario. The United States declared war on Britain because of British interference. And the British Royal Navy gets the Americans. This is Mackinac Island in Michigan. And this is where one of the first major battles takes place between the Brits and the Americans. It's not Canada. In the months following the U.S. declaration of war, American forces launched a three-point invasion of northern British territories, which were all repulsed. At sea, though, the United States somehow, some way, was able to go up and stand toe-to-toe with the strongest navy in the world, the Brits. The USS Constitution and other American frigates won a series of victories over British warships. In 1813, American forces won some key victories in the Great Lakes region, but Britain regained control of the sea and blockaded the eastern seaboard: New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, South Carolina. You walk through downtown Halifax, and there's a question. There's a bunch of boards like this, and there's a question saying, well, why aren't we Americans? Why are we Canadians? It's a question that Americans never ask, but it's a question Canadians now ask. This guy is Major General Robert Ross, and he has a major footnote in American history. Have you ever heard of Major General Robert Ross in Britain? The White House? The Star-Spangled Banner? Well, Ross is the guy who led the charge to burn down the White House.
And Betsy Ross.
No, it has nothing to do with Betsy Ross. 1814, Washington, D.C. fell to the British in August. In Washington, British troops burned the White House, the Capitol, and other buildings in retaliation for earlier burning of government buildings in Canada, Britain rather, by U.S. soldiers. And they marched another 40 miles to this place. There's my son when he's 9 years old, Fort William McKendree. How much do you know about Fort William McKendree in Baltimore?
Say that again.
But the British can't get past Fort McHenry. There's a bombardment in the Baltimore Harbor, and the local ships withstood the massive British bombardment and inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, which in 1931 would become the American national anthem. Ain't over until it's over. One guy once said that to me when I used to speak at his museum in Montclair, New Jersey. I think the guy's name was Lawrence Peter Bearer, who once told me, ain't over till it's over. September 11th, 1814, the tide of the war turned when the American naval force under Thomas MacDonough won a decisive victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh in New York on Lake Champlain. The Brits, well, they would abandon their hopes in upstate New York. They were under Sir George Provost, and they retreat into Canada. This guy here is Albert Gallatin. This is a statue of Gallatin in Washington. He's the guy, the U.S. envoy, who would sign the Treaty of Ghent. December 24th to 1814, it's signed. And it's back to the 1812 borders. Britain gives up American land near the border of the Great Lakes. U.S. gives up Ontario and returns land that it seized in Florida to Spain. President James Madison signs the agreement on February 17, 1815, and that's the last time that Brits or the Canadians went after the Americans. So here's the question. If you're Canadian, why did Canada win the war? Because the Americans never invaded again. That's why they won the war. If you're American, you think, hey, we won the War of 1812. Well, not really. But there was one more battle, Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson, the Battle of New Orleans, which was a wasted battle. Old Hickory said we get taken by surprise. What happened? Well, it took almost 2 months for the news of the treaty to come across the Atlantic, and the British forces were not told that the hostilities were over. And they're going down the Mississippi, and they're going to New Orleans. On January 8, 1815, a large British army attacked New Orleans and was decimated by an inferior American force under General Andrew Jackson. In the most spectacular U.S. victory of the war was over. It was done. But there was a good thing that came out of it. Remember Johnny Horton, the singer? In 1814, we took a little trip down the mighty Mississippi, the Battle of New Orleans. It's a top-selling song for Johnny Horton. Just think if that battle didn't take place, he'd only have one hit, North to Alaska. War of 1812, last major conflict between England and Canada, ends officially in 1815. Territorial disputes were settled, Canadians, or the Brits, and for Native Americans, this is a decisive turning point. They're losing the struggle to govern themselves. Eventually, Canadians would go to Prince Edward Island to discuss their destiny. See that island there? That island is where all of the French went. 600 at a time during the expulsion. It's in the Halifax Harbor. If you survive there, most didn't, but if you survived there, you got on a ship, you went to French territories. If you were going to Louisiana, they sent you down to Haiti, what would become Haiti. And then you went back to Louisiana. And that's the Citadel in Halifax to protect the city. Nova Scotia became the first colony in British North America and the British Empire to achieve responsible government February 1848 through the efforts of Joseph Howe. Nova Scotia had a representative government 1858. They were looking to leave since the American Revolution. In 1857, the province of Canada, as it was called by the Queen, was in need of a permanent seat for government, a capital. For 15 years, the government had moved from one place to another. Kingston in 1841, Montreal, 1844, Toronto, 1849, Quebec City, 1855. What was wrong with all these places? Well, Kingston, and there I was in Kingston in 1984, too close to the U.S. Besides, it was named Kingston, named after the king. And it was so close to the United States, where the Thousand Islands are in upstate New York, they were afraid that the capital would be sacked. In the 1850s, someone thought it was a good idea for Upper and Lower Canada to have a capital. Quebec City's in the running, as is Montreal, as is Kingston. But Montreal, too French. That's not going to work. Quebec City, too French as well. New Year's Eve, 1857, Queen Victoria, as a symbolic and political gesture, was represented or was presented with the responsibility of selecting a location for the permanent capital of the province, not the nation, the province of Canada. And they found this place called Ottawa. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald was assigned the selection process, even he was the guy who picked it out, to the executive branch of government after previous attempts to arrive at a consensus ended in a deadlock. So why Ottawa? Well, Ottawa is halfway between Quebec City and Toronto, and in those days you rode by horse, so or train. So that kind of worked out. The Queen's choice turned out to be this small frontier town named Bytown. Came Ottawa. Two reasons. Ottawa's isolated location in the backcountry, surrounded by a dense forest far from the American border, 41 miles. Situated on a cliff, made it more defensible from attack. And you can see it's situated on the cliff. The other thing was malaria. That whole entire area that you can now drive up 16 from upstate New York into Ottawa was filled with malaria. And they figured, there's no way American troops are going to go attack us, and first by going through malaria. So it's a good place. Midway between Toronto and Kingston in Canada's west, and Montreal and Quebec City, Canada's east. But Nova Scotia was pretty much on its own, while the others were Ontario and Prince Edward Island and Quebec were controlled by Great Britain. Ottawa becomes the capital. That is the equivalent of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It's Confederate Hall in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. And the last time I was up there, they were doing renovations, which was 4 years ago, 5 years ago. September 1864, Prince Edward Island hosted the Charlottetown Conference. That's the first meeting, which led to the Quebec resolutions and the creation of Canada in 1867. There's an Alaska problem. One of the reasons that Canada becomes a country is because of Alaska. And that was made 4th of July 2017 in Sitka, which was the last Russian capital in North America in the territory of Alaska. Welcome to Sitka. The Alaska Purchase forced the British colonists to form a country. They formed a country 3 months after the Alaska Purchase. Russia sold Alaska to the US, so Great Britain didn't get it. Russia needed the money from the Crimean War, $7.2 million, 2 cents an acre, which is, or close to $1 billion today. They lost, the Russians lost the Crimean War. The northern colonists began looking at the United States, so we should have our own country in 1839. And then there was another problem, Civil War. America had just finished the Civil War. After the Civil War, the pro-Canadian Conference premier, Charles Tupper, led Nova Scotia into the Canadian Conference July 1st, 1867, along with New Brunswick and the province of Canada, Ontario. Almost 3 months later, an election, September 18th, 1867, the Anti-Confederation Party won 18 of 19 federal seats, 36 of 38 seats in the provincial legislature. Canada was born. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, Quebec, all in. Prince Edward Island, where they first had the first conference, isn't in. Oh, there's Niagara Falls, Ontario. How many of you have been up to Niagara Falls? Which side do you like better, the Canadian side or the American side?
Canadian.
Yeah, there's a lot to do in the other side. There's nothing to do with it. Well, then I got a casino in Niagara Falls, New York now. So anyway, there's the falls. Reasons to leave? Britain, political deadlock because of the current political structure. Demographic pressure, population expansion out to British Columbia. Economic nationalism, the promise of economic development. An intercolony railroad, that's what they wanted, to improve trade, military movement, and transportation and shipping. There was the cancellation of the Canadian-American Reciprocity Treaty, free trade policy, whereby products were allowed into the United States without taxes or tariffs in 1854, which was then considered a benefit to Canada. In 1865, the United States, as revenge against Great Britain, for support in the South in the Civil War, said, we're going to cancel that treaty. Two John Hamilton Grays, meeting in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, discussing the country. And the possible threat of an invasion from the United States increased with the Alaska Purchase, because now the Americans can come from the Northwest, not just the South, but from the Northwest, and invade that territory. The United States Senate, Charles Summers and others, they supported, let's go to Alaska, and we'll take over the remainder of North America from the British. Seward's Folly. Anybody go to Seward High School in Lower Manhattan? My mother did. So did Bernie Schwartz. Know who Bernie Schwartz is? Tony Curtis. William Henry Seward. This statue erected in 2017 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Treaty of Cession that was negotiated with Russia by Seward, resulting in the transfer of Alaska to the United States. There was something called the Fenian Raids, Irish Republican organization in the United States. They were raiding British forts in Canada in 1866. The Little England philosophy, whereby Britain no longer wanted to maintain troops in the colonies. And pressure from British financiers who say, hey, we've lost a lot of money on the railroads in Canada or in the British Northern Territories. So you get Canada, July 1st, 1867. America now surrounded the British colonial territory. Northwest border, Alaska. South, the 49th parallel, was U.S. territories. Canada starts in the east. 1867, there were three options open to Canada. Stay as a British colony, be annexed by the Americans, or confederate with the newly formed Dominican of Canada. In Britain, some hoped that its North American colonies would just leave. Goodbye, we don't want you anymore. But there was more. Ships and demands. Alabama is involved in this. Now, you might ask, how is Alabama involved in all this? They're nowhere near the Canadian border. The Alabama claims a series of demands for damages sought by the government of the United States from the United Kingdom, 1869, for attacks upon Union merchant ships by Confederate Navy commerce raiders built in Britain during the American Civil War. British Columbia, that's British Columbia. It's one of the prettiest places you will ever want to go in the world. That's British Columbia. The American Secretary of State was William Seward. He negotiated the purchase of Alaska, and they are going to get control of the entire Pacific coast, Pacific coast. And Seward thought, yeah, the Brits are going to come. Don't worry about it. We'll get British Columbia. They'll come to the United States. And we're going to, you know what, we'll forget about those claims if British Columbia comes in. Except British Columbia had a problem. British Columbia didn't want those drunken Washingtoners to come across into British Columbia and propose putting up a wall to keep the Americans out of British Columbia. And that is BC, that is Victoria. London continued to stall about a settlement, and American commerce and financial groups said to Washington, get some cash. There was growing Canadian nationalism in British Columbia. Let's stay inside the British Empire. Congress became preoccupied with Reconstruction, and well, the Americans decided, you know, we don't need British Columbia, and that's why British Columbia is in Canada now and not in the United States. Canada, it's a large country. There's the map. It goes from Newfoundland, Labrador, all the way up to the Yukon territories, down to British Columbia. And by the way, do you know that Windsor, Ontario is the most southern Canadian city? It's south of Detroit. It is south of Detroit. And if you look at the map, you can see Ottawa is basically on the same plane as Maine, 41 miles from the U.S. border. Canada has 11 provinces, 2 territories. Atlantic to the Pacific, onto the Arctic Ocean. It's got 3.85 million square miles, second largest country by total area. The southern border goes 5,525 miles. It's the longest binational land border. Another picture of Canada in 2017. Canada's southern border. So the provinces, Alberta comes in September 1st, 1905. British Columbia is an outlier. They come in 1871 and they're nowhere near anything else. Manitoba, where Winnipeg is, July 15, 1870. New Brunswick comes in the first day. Newfoundland comes in March 31st, 1949. Northwest Territories created 1870. Nova Scotia comes in first. Nunavut is the latest territory. It comes in, well, it's a province. It comes in April 1st, 1999. Ontario comes in day one. Prince Edward Island comes in 6 years later, 1873. Quebec, first day. Saskatchewan, where they first started paving roads. Saskatoon in 1958 comes in September 1st, 1905. Yukon is established as a territory in 1898. Northwest Territory and Yukon are not provinces. And there is the map where the Vikings actually landed. You know, there were Vikings in Newfoundland back in the 10th and 11th century. The Vikings were the first, quote unquote, members of Western civilization to actually get here. The Atlantic provinces depended on the seas for their livelihood, fishing. How many of you enjoy Nova Scotia locks?
The what?
Nova Scotia locks. You know, when you get your schmear and the bagel and the locks, right? The Vikings discovered North America, although the area was popular. This is where they discovered St. Anthony's in Newfoundland. More than likely, they were looking for wood when they ended up near St. Anthony's, Newfoundland, around the year 1000. There are ruins suggesting that. John Cabot, who was a Venetian sailing for Britain, claimed the land in 1497. The only confirmed Viking site on the American continent is L'Anne-aux-Meadows, 10,000-year way station discovered in 1960, the northern tip of Newfoundland. This is where radio started. See that top of that house? That's where radio started. St. John's, Newfoundland. That's where Marconi was when he picked up the first signal of radio in 1901. Newfoundland, self-governing by 1855, joins the Confederation, 1949. They depended on fishing. It hit a low in 1992 with cod dwindling. 30,000 fishermen lose their jobs. Prince Edward Island, it's where everything happened in that building. It's an island, and there are small islands around it. It's one of 3 maritime provinces. It's the smallest province in land and population. Well, didn't want to join the Canadian group. Didn't like the terms of the agreement. Brits, Canadians didn't want to pay for the railroad on PEI. They even asked the United States, can we become a state? Eventually, PEI chose to remain a British colony. PEI officials met with American counterparts in 1868. Did you know this? That Prince Edward Island was almost an American state. But they wanted trade options, but they couldn't actually do any kind of dealing with the Americans without the Brits giving them permission. PEI joins the Confederacy in 1873. It's the 7th province. 25% of Canadian potatoes are grown in PEI. And any of you ever read Anne of Green Gables?
Yes.
That's all about PEI. That's the Yukon Territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Some quick maritime facts. New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia form Atlantic Canada. Less wealthy than the rest of Canada. Fishing is the major livelihood. Oil has been discovered off of Nova Scotia. Newfoundland and Labrador became one land in 1927. Before COVID-19, Halifax was one of the fastest growing cities in North America. They had just basically fished out Vancouver by that point. At St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador, and at St. John, New Brunswick, where Benedict Arnold ran into some problems. It was first settled by France in 1604. That's Acadia. Great Britain gets the land in 1713. The Acadians exiled 1755. The Carriacou would eventually be at the site of the return in 1758. It was the first St. John's was the first incorporated city, 1785, because of the Loyalists fleeing the U.S. How many of you have heard of Louis B. Mayer?
Of course.
Louis B. Mayer, MGM,
Yeah.
right? Well, he ended up in St. John. That's his synagogue. That's where he went to shul. He bequeathed money to that place. That money, even though there was only a handful of Jews that remained in St. John's, his money is still running that synagogue. And they have Passover there every year. They got all their stuff shipped in from Montreal, and all the Jewish families in St. John go there. That's where they have Passover. St. John, New Brunswick. Halifax and St. John, New Brunswick was the first place of entry for Canadian immigrants. That's how Louis B. Mayer ended up. Didn't come to New York, didn't come to Boston. He ended up in St. John. Canada did not place quotas on immigration until 1933, which meant Jews from Eastern Europe could still get into Canada until 1933. 1924, Americans stopped immigration and put quotas on people who could come in from Eastern Europe. St. John's, New Brunswick, Reverse Falls, where supposedly the rivers go the wrong way. Halifax, there's the train station in Halifax. The Citadel, the ramparts in Quebec City. The capital in Ottawa. Montreal, the Olympic Stadium. Oh, First Nation. The United States has problems with Native Americans, reservations and all. Same problems exist in Canada with the First Nations. And there is Toronto on a foggy day in September 2017. Alberta, welcome to Alberta. That's a Vancouver sunrise. That is one of my friends and my wife in Victoria 5 years ago. Hockey, 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 but it's not the national sport of Canada. Lacrosse is the national sport of Canada. That's me and Gordie Howe, the great hockey player back in 1984. Tim Hortons Donuts. Get your donuts at Tim Hortons. Tim was a great hockey player, went into the donut business. With a guy named Ron Joyce, eventually they tried to get into the American marketplace, still trying, not really all that successful. Birthplace of Canada, PEI. Canada has been aligned with England. They finally got almost full independence in 1983. But they were British territory, and they entered World War I. In 1914, the United States entered the war, World War I in 1917. Canada entered World War II in 1939 when England got involved. The Americans did not get involved in World War II until December 7, 1941. Canada is independent. Canada achieved nearly full independence from the United Kingdom thanks to the Statute of Westminster, 1931. Full Sovereignty Act was attained when the Canada Act removed the last remaining ties of legal dependence on Parliament of the United Kingdom. Canada is a federal parliamentary democracy. They do have the constitutional queen, Queen Elizabeth. She's the head of state, but she's just the figurehead. The country is bilingual at the federal level. And the Queen is very well liked. You go through Canada, you'll find spots where they put up a statue of Queen Elizabeth. She made an appearance in St. John's, Newfoundland, and they put a statue up for her. Queen Elizabeth is the ceremonial head of state, but she appoints a representative to each province. Supposedly that representative is there to tell her what's going on. Prince Edward Island, and there's the Queen, Prince Edward Island. July 1st is a national holiday, but in Quebec, St. John Baptiste Day seems to be a bigger holiday. It takes place on June 24th of each year. American and Canadians have a very close relationship, extremely close relationship. New York's biggest trade partner is Ontario. One of the United States' biggest trade partners is Canada. Some of the electricity that you have in this building, you know where it comes from? Quebec. Quebec Hydroelectric. The Iranian crisis, 1980. Thank you, Canada. Well, there was a thank you to Canada in 1980. Because on January 29th, about a little more than 2 months after the Iranians seized the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, January 29th, 1980, and the Canadian government conducted a successful undercover operation to evacuate 6 of the American hostages who had found refuge with Canadian diplomats in Tehran during the early months of that prolonged hostage crisis. Oh, Canada also has a piece of the space program. The Canadian Space Agency is the National Space Agency of Canada, established in 1990 by the Canadian Space Agency Act. The Canadian Space Agency is there to promote the peaceful use and development of space, to advance knowledge of space through science, and to ensure that space science and technology would provide or provides economic and social benefits for Canadians. It works closely with NASA and the Americans. So we've gone through Canada. Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister. Sault Ste. Marie, on both sides, American side, Canadian side, one of the largest ports in North America. Lots of traffic flows through there. And there are 2 Sault Ste. Maries. And you might know that there are some houses in Vermont and in New Hampshire. A piece of the house is here in Vermont. A piece of the house is here in Quebec. So you go watch TV in Quebec and eat dinner in Vermont. Young people in Canada don't say A anymore. Nobody knows why people said, well, why do people say A? A? Canada, A? That's their 150th birthday today, or 55th birthday today. And they remain close friends. They're kind of, if you live in an apartment, they're the neighbors upstairs. And they watch closely what is going on downstairs. In Nova Scotia, there are joint military exercises between the United States and Canada, just outside of Halifax. Norway is 2 countries. People in British Columbia have more in common with people in Washington and Oregon than they do with people in the East. Toronto is the New York of Canada. And subsequently, Toronto is hated by most Canadians because it's got the media, it's got the Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team, which, you know, they're supposed to be great, which they're not. It's got baseball, it's got basketball, it's got, it's the financial powerhouse. Manitoba is a banking center, though. Manitoba is a banking center. Saskatchewan is where you get wheat. Alberta is like Texas. That's where you get the oil in Alberta, and there's lots of oil in Alberta. And there'll be squabbles between the United States and Canada. I covered one, the Newfoundland Premier. Clyde Wells was once at the UN complaining about how the U.S. was fishing all of this cod out of his area. And I had to go to the United Nations to cover this story because he was complaining about what was going on. Now the complaints are about fishing, lumber, not really big issues. But Canada did have plans to defend itself until about 1931 in the event that the Americans decided to invade again. So who won the War of 1812? The Americans win? No. Canadians win? Couldn't have. They were in the country. Did the British win? Nah, they just went back to where they were. Anyway, thank you. Any questions or any comments you want to know if I was going to talk about Halifax?
Nova Scotia.
Yeah, Nova Scotia. So you like Nova Scotia locks, I take it?
So Canada became a country after